This video was going to be about my constructed old school deck when I started old school. Not old school like when I played way back when. That was different. What's the right phrase? Modern old school? That sounds silly. That can't be right. Current old school? The format we know is old school. So I'd like to go over my deck and share it just because I feel like sharing it, really. It's not something that I've ever done before, to be honest. When I played back in the 90s, you didn't share your deck list with anyone because they would put in cards specifically to beat your deck. Like, you didn't want your opponents to know what you were playing, obviously. So there were certain cards called hosers, like Circle of Protections and things like that. If you were playing a monocolor deck and someone played a Circle of Protection, then you had a hard time getting around it sometimes. So, and there could be other things too. There's other cards that are specifically, great against other deck types. So yeah, I've never shared a deck publicly before. I don't really like net decking. So if you don't make a deck just like this one I'm about to show you, I'm perfectly fine with that. If you do decide to make a deck just like this, I suppose that's okay, but try to make it your own a little bit. Maybe your play style is a little bit different than mine. Maybe this deck isn't perfect. I mean, heck, I just said it's my first old school deck for a constructed format. It's probably not going to be top notch. So, here we go. It's a new series for me, I guess. Deck Techs. So I've decided finally, after all these years, that maybe it's okay to share my deck list with someone else. That's probably because I don't play very often, and I did take the time to make the deck, and I like it. I kind of want to show it to people, and I don't get to play very often, so this is my way to show the deck, I guess, since I'm not showing it by playing it. I do play it, occasionally when I go places, but there's a whole lot of you out there in the world that play old school that I'm not playing against. And so this gives me a chance to show you guys what I've been doing. By the way, I should figure out how to set up an online game and play online, right? I've had a few requests for people that want me to do that and, get some games in. And that sounds fun. I should do that sometime. Maybe I get to play more often. But for now, I'm going to start sharing this deck that I made. Here we go. So, I've explained how I got to here, and I'm looking to build my first constructed old school deck. So, first step, brainstorming. What do I want to build? I'm not really a Timmy player. I used to be when I very first started, but the big creature thing, I got tired of it. Didn't work. You lose a lot. Wasn't my thing. What I really like is combo. When I found some combo cards, yeah, that was me. Combo cards, and particularly infinite combos. Love those. I also like alternate win conditions. Milling, things like that. Poison counters. Poison counters, I could never get it to work back in the day. Infect is awesome, though, but that's a whole nother subject. That's not old school. So, yeah, I'm pretty much a Johnny player. If you're familiar with the different archetypes, Timmy, Johnny, and Spike, I am a Johnny. I like combo, and I'm pretty happy if I can get my combo to do its thing. I have fun playing, and I try to win. So I did play in tournament Magic back in the 90s. I was pretty good. So probably one of the top players at my local game store. A couple years there, I was like the person to beat. So to a certain extent, I played like a Spike, at least back then. So I like, Johnny decks, combo stuff, but I build it so that it's good, because the goal is to try to win, right? Not just doing stuff for nothing. So I'm really rusty. I hadn't played nearly as frequently as I used to back in the 90s, and so I'm not as good at this as I used to be, but hopefully I can still build a deck, especially with the old cards I'm familiar with. So what was I going to build for this tournament that I was going to go to? I didn't know much about the metagame. I know what I would be up against. Other constructed decks. Could be anything. But my general impression was that the deck by Brian Weissman, I showed you the paper a minute ago, was about 50% of the format. I expected to come up against a lot of decks that were based on that kind of permission control decks, a lot of blue. I also expected about 25% of the format to be aggro, big creatures, stompy stuff. Maybe some weenie decks, but creature-based, straightforward. And 25% to be combo doing who knows what. So that's just my rough guess for what I was expecting to be against. I didn't really have anything to base it on, but I wanted to keep it in mind when I was building my deck. I was also under the impression that people like to draw cards. That's a really great thing to do, draw cards, card advantage. That's an important thing. And so I was thinking I wanted to build a deck that would punish people for drawing cards. And the first place I looked was Underworld Dreams. I was thinking I would build an Underworld Dreams deck so that people would take damage when they drew cards. Now, I started to build that deck, or to design it anyway, on paper, and I was looking at different options, and I decided not to go with that because I found another card that I thought was more interesting. And that card was this one right here. Chains of Mephistopheles. So, Chains of Mephistopheles is a pretty cool card. The thing that I liked better about it over Underworld Dreams is that Underworld Dreams cost 3 black mana, which you can totally get out on turn 1 with a Dark Ritual or a Black Lotus. But that's still 3 of all the same color. It's a pretty hefty casting cost. And Chains of Mephistopheles only costs 2, and only one of them is required to be black. So it's more versatile if you want to put it in a multicolored deck. Easier to play. You can play this on turn 1 with any one of the Moxes. Soul Ring, Lotus, and any land that makes black, which is just a deck design issue. You just have to make sure your lands can make black. That's pretty easy to do. So this was a way easier card to play. So what Chains of Mephistopheles does is confuse your opponents because of all of this text. It's really tiny and hard to read. Alright, so what it really does is each player, that's both of you, or if it's a multiplayer game, all of you, on your turn during your draw step, you get your regular draw, normally. Nothing strange going on. you just get your draw. Any other draws at any other time, if you draw, if you're going to draw for some reason, then what you have to do is discard a card from your hand before drawing. So let's say you had a Jayemdae Tome out and you tapped it, activated it to draw a card. Then what you would have to do is discard a card from your hand before you draw a card. So what Chains of Mephistopheles does is it helps to eliminate card advantage. So all of those cards in your opponent's deck that are designed to draw become way less useful. Things like Ancestral Recall, Jayemdae Tome, Wheel of Fortune, Time Twister, maybe there's some others, but those are the big ones. So when you discard and draw, that's kind of like, filtering. You still get a choice there. So you end up with cards, but it's not as good as ending up with all the cards. It's significantly less card advantage. The other thing that Chains of Mephistopheles does is that if you can't discard a card, then instead of drawing, you mill that card. Mill is a term that's based on millstone. It means you take the card from your library and you put it in your graveyard. They should keyword that. Anyway, so let's say, same example of Jayemdae Tome. You tap it to draw a card. Because Chains is in play, you have to discard a card in order to draw a card. Now, if you can't discard a card, then that card you were going to draw goes to your graveyard. And that's what Chains of Mephistopheles does. A lot of little words, confuses a lot of people. So I wanted to play that because I wanted to make all those draw cards that I expected my opponents to be playing less useful. I thought that would help me a lot. So I looked at that and I started to brainstorm ideas for what would go with it. And being a combo type player, I looked at that card and I said, all right, how do I break that card? How do I make it just ridiculous? And so I looked at what happens if I have two of them in play. Two Chains of Mephistopheles. Well, what happens is that each one triggers. So let's look at the Jayemdae Tome example again. So you activate the tome to draw a card. First Chains triggers. You have to discard a card in order to draw a card. The second Chains also triggers, so you have to discard a card for that one also in order to draw a card. So the way that works is you activate the Jayemdae Tome and you have to discard a card for each Chains in play before you can draw. So you activate it to draw one, but you have to discard two to get one. And I looked at that and I said, wow. If you have to discard two to get one, you could run out of cards really easy. And so that's what I set out to do. I wanted to make a deck where your opponent didn't get to draw a card ever for the rest of the game. I wanted to lock down their ability to draw cards. That sounded fun to me. I had no idea whether I was going to win this event that I was going to. It was my first in a long time, and I thought that would be fun to try to do, and maybe it would even work. So my goal was to get out 2 Chains of Mephistopheles and find a way to trigger a draw in their draw step other than their normal draw. Because if I could do that, well, I'll show you what happens in a minute. So there's a perfect card for making your opponent draw an extra card in their draw step. That card is Howling Mine. So, Howling Mine. Each player must draw 1 extra card during the draw phase of each of his or her turns. So Howling Mine is a card that I normally don't like much. When I was a new player, way back in the 90s, I tried playing with that because, hey, drawing cards is great. But it killed me more often than it helped me, and so I abandoned Howling Mine. The reason that it killed me is because when you play it, your opponent gets to draw the extra card before you do, and that inevitably led to them having more advantage from Howling Mine than I had when I played it. Now, when my opponent plays a Howling Mine, I usually like it. That's great. But I didn't like to play them myself. But in this deck, I need that trigger. I need them to draw an extra card during their draw step. Draw phase, step phase, whatever they call it. Okay, so let's say that these cards are out. And not all of them. That's just how many I put in the deck. So let's say you have 1 Chains of Mephistopheles out and 1 Howling Mine. Let's just start with 1 Howling Mine. Okay, let's say you have 1 Howling Mine out. We'll make this simple. Here's what happens. Each player draws an extra card during their draw step. Pretty straightforward. Okay, let's say you have a Howling Mine and a Chains of Mephistopheles in play. Here's the way it works. Each player, during their draw, they take their regular draw, they get their regular one fine, then the Howling Mine triggers, that triggers the Chains, they have to discard one of the cards from their hand, any card, and then they get to draw for the Howling Mine. If they can't discard for some reason, then they would mill one. But having just drawn one, they likely can discard. If the card they drew happens to be an instant, they could play it and mill one, rather than discard. That's up to them, whether they want to play their instant before the triggers of Howling Mine and Chains. It's a possibility, something that should be mentioned. Okay, next step. What happens if you have Howling Mine and 2 Chains of Mephistopheles in play? So here's how it goes. You get your regular draw, just fine. Then you get Howling Mine. Howling Mine triggers both Chains. You have to discard 2 cards in order to draw 1 card. So, in the previous example, with 1 Howling Mine and 1 Chains, you draw a card, discard a card, and draw a card, so you gain 1 card. With a Howling Mine and 2 Chains of Mephistopheles, you draw a card, you discard 2 cards, and you draw a card, so you gain no cards. You've drawn 2, and you've lost 2. Now, you may have different cards, but you haven't gained any cards. And what that means is that if you play any cards, land, whatever, then very soon you won't have any cards to discard. And if you don't have any cards to discard, then you won't be drawing any cards. So by having 1 Howling Mine and 2 Chains of Mephistopheles, you put your opponent in a position where they can't play their cards unless it's the exact card they need to break the combo, the lock. If they can break out of this, then they can go back to playing. If they can't, if they don't have the cards in hand to break it, then they just sit there, exchanging cards, hoping to find the right one, before you win the game. Or they make a mistake, play a card, and then they never draw again. Alright, so how do I plan to win if neither of us is going to be drawing any cards or have any cards in hand? That is where this comes into play. The rack. So the rack, if an opponent has fewer than 3 cards in hand during his or her upkeep, the rack does 1 damage to opponent for each card fewer than 3. This is going to be hurting them. 3 damage every turn if they have no cards in hand for each rack in play. That's a pretty good win condition, I think, for a deck that's going to make them not be able to draw anything and likely not have any cards in hand. Another cool thing about it is that it doesn't hurt me, it only hurts my opponent. That's something to mention here. This Howling Mine Chains combo, it doesn't affect just your opponent. It also affects you. So you have to keep that in mind. You're sort of filtering through your cards when you draw too, to try to find the best ones. So before you get a Howling Mine and 2 Chains in play, you need to have the rack in play or in your hand. At least 1. Here is the next card. Copy Artifact. That's a great card. That can copy the rack or the Howling Mine. So this is like having 6 Howling Mines in your deck. By the way, if you play more Howling Mines or more Chains, either more than 1 Howling Mine or more than 2 Chains, the whole process snowballs. It gets even bigger and out of control faster. Your opponent would pretty much have no cards. It's very likely in this deck that you and your opponent are both going to have no cards and stop drawing. It takes a little bit to get used to that, but that's what it's designed to do. Alright, what else did I put in this deck? Demonic Tutor, of course. In a combo deck, you need Tutor. It gets your pieces. So that increases your chances of getting whatever you need. And that's why I have 4 of these also, is to increase my chances of getting them. Same with Copy Artifact, that helps too. Alright, Ancestral Recall. That also helps me to get what I want. You know, draw 3 cards. That's great. It's also kind of neat to use on your opponent. Like if you happen to have this stuff going on, now all of a sudden they get to, here, discard 6 to draw 3, like, or maybe here, mill 3 cards or mill 6 cards or whatever if their hand's empty. That really heads them more towards the danger zone with the rack. So that's versatile. It's a good card. It's probably the best card in Magic. What else did I put in this deck? Oop. There we go. Stuck together. Okay. Winds of Change. This is a cool card with Chains of Mephistopheles. All players shuffle their hand into their libraries and then draw the same number of cards they originally had. This card empties your hand, and then you draw that many cards. So, with Chains of Mephistopheles in play, even just one of them, let's say you have, let's go ahead and do the example. So, one Chains of Mephistopheles in play, and then you cast Winds of Change. Discard your hand, you have no more cards in hand. However many cards you had in your hand, you get to draw that many cards. Chains triggers for each one of those, and because you can't discard, you have no cards in hand, you then mill that many cards. So let's say you had 5 cards in hand, you shuffle those cards into your library, that's what Winds of Change says, and then you mill 5, still having no cards in hand. So this becomes like a mind twist for your whole hand. It empties your hand and mills some, which is great for, the rack. Now your opponent has no cards. It only costs 1 red mana. Super cheap. Yes, I played 4 of them. It's true that after the first one, your opponent won't have any cards in their hand, so the other copies won't be very useful in your deck. But if your combo's set up right, you probably won't ever draw other copies because no one will be drawing cards. So having 4 copies just makes it more likely that you'll draw it when you need it. It's a probability thing. Okay, next card, Wheel of Fortune. All players must discard their hands and draw 7 new cards. Works very similar to Winds of Change. All of a sudden, you have no cards in hand, and you're milling 7 cards. If you have 2 chains in play, you're milling 14 cards, because they both trigger. That's a lot of cards to go through. Next card, Time Twister. Works very similar to Wheel of Fortune. Shuffle your hand, library, and graveyard together, so you have nothing in hand, and then you draw 7 new. So you can't draw them because you can't discard them, so you mill them. That's the way Chains works. So it's going to end up shuffle everything together into a new deck, a new library, and then mill 7 off of it. Or if you have multiple chains, you mill 7 for each chains in play. Amazing card, and leaving your opponent very vulnerable to the rack. The next card is Mind Twist. That's just good for emptying their hand. It works with the rack. Keeps them from doing things, gets rid of good cards. It's just a great card. Doesn't have quite the synergy as some of this other stuff, but it's very good. Especially if you're playing a lot of fast mana in the deck. If you can, Mind Twist on turn 1 for a lot, or heck, let them play their turn 1 and their 1-drop or whatever they're going to do, and then mind twist the remaining good cards out of their hand. That's probably a better play. Next we have Balance. Balance also works for getting rid of cards in their hand if you don't have cards in your hand. But the main reason Balance is in here is actually for creature removal. It's basically like a Wrath of God for 2 mana. And that's because you don't see creatures here. As you can see, this deck needs to be concerned about creatures. If your opponent's, beating you down every turn, you're really on the clock. You don't have much time. And so this empties the board, and that helps. Especially if they can't draw to replace the cards. Let's see, Balance also gets rid of cards in hand, creatures in play, lands, so artifacts are okay. Either way, that's kind of indifferent. Mainly it's here for creatures. It also helps with the card situation. Before I go any further, I wanted to mention another thing about Howling Mine. Sometimes your opponent will play that in their deck, and then you don't have to. That's pretty handy. Okay, back to balance. So, as I mentioned, creatures can be an issue. The next card that we're going to have here is the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale. This is an anti-creature card. All creatures now require an upkeep of 1. I don't have to worry about that much, not having creatures, but if the opponent's playing some kind of a weenie deck, or playing a lot of creatures, then this might get rid of some creatures. If nothing else, it'll really slow them down. It'll occupy their mana to have to pay that, and that means they're not doing other things. So that's good for me. Now, yes, there are 3 of them here. It's a legendary land, you can only have 1 in play. But it's nice to be able to draw it fairly consistently, so multiple copies are good for that. I also find that it gets targeted a lot with land destruction like Strip Mine or something. So, when it's really been hurting them for a couple turns and they finally get rid of it and then you just drop down another one, that's pretty fun. So, along the same line of getting rid of creatures, we have the Abyss. The casting cost is 4, which is quite a bit higher than most of this other stuff, but it's a great card. It buries a creature every turn. So bury 1 target non-artifact creature under their control if they have any during their upkeep. Now, bury means it can't regenerate. That's pretty awesome. So, whereas this helps with weenie type decks, this is great for stompy decks, big creatures, Timmy stuff. It doesn't help against a few cards. Artifact creatures, it doesn't do anything with. It doesn't do anything with lands like Mistress Factory. And it also doesn't do anything against protection from black, such as White Knight or Whirling Dervish. Whirling Dervish should get played more. But most creatures you come up against, this is going to be shutting people down. Next card, Chaos Orb. This is for getting rid of whatever problem your opponent puts down. That's an answer. I am not very good at flipping this. I suggest practicing your Chaos Orb flips if you're going to be playing with a Chaos Orb. Next, couple Shatter. Destroy target artifact. Pretty straightforward. The main artifact that I'm looking out for is Nevinyrral's Disc. That card is trouble. So that would be a primary target for these 3 cards. Troll Disco is a deck that uses Nevinyrral's Disc to wipe the board and then regenerates its own creatures. So I really have to watch out for those decks because the disc will wipe my board state, and that's a problem. Even though their creatures don't regenerate from the Abyss, and they have trouble keeping them in play with Tabernacle, I still have trouble getting things going with that disc. The next cards are Mistress Factory. I have 1 of each here. We'll put the winter one on top. It's popular. So, Mistress Factory. Great card. That is the creature in my deck. I know it's a land, and that means it's not going to be affected by either of these during my upkeep. It's also not going to be affected by balance unless I choose to activate the factory, which I probably wouldn't do. So, Mistress Factory is a great card, especially since you can tap it to pump itself and still do damage. That's something you couldn't do way back when, but since 6th edition, that rule has been updated, and now tapped creatures still do damage, making Mistress Factory an even better card than it already was. So yeah, this stays in play, even though these are getting rid of creatures. So hopefully, I'll have the only creatures in play, and I can be attacking with these to end the game faster. So this is damage in addition to this damage, while my opponent's not drawing. Of course, I'm not drawing either, but this will let me do damage even though I'm not drawing. So if I don't have these out, I can still win with this, and, vice versa. So what do you do if your opponent has Mistress Factories? Well, that's a problem. First answer is going to be Strip Mine. I'm only running 3 here. Strip Mine is for getting rid of your opponent's Mistress Factories. You could also use it to get rid of other bothersome lands, maybe a Library of Alexandria. An early library is bad, but after you've got your combo out, then library really doesn't help. Library is actually a bad card after you have your combo out. They can tap it to, well, probably do nothing because they won't have 7 cards. So, yeah. So Strip Mine is mainly for getting rid of opponents' Mistress Factories, or at least making sure that they have less of them than you do. Another way to make sure of that is Copy Artifact here. Copy Artifact can be used to copy an activated Mistress Factory. What happens in that situation is that the Copy Artifact comes into play as a copy of a freshly played Mistress Factory. So it comes into play as an unactivated land. The Copy Artifact does. So yeah, it's like having 6 Mistress Factories in your deck if you decide to use them that way. Copy Artifact is, like I said, it's a pretty cool card. Next is land. I need land in this deck if I'm going to play any of these cards. So here are 3 bad lands. They make red and black. That's pretty handy because there's a lot of red and black in this deck. I notice most of these casting costs are pretty low. This is a fairly speedy deck. It's easy to get this stuff out. Here is 3 Underground Seas. Black and blue, as you can see. That's another popular theme here, black and blue. And then 4 City of Brass. Yes, it hurts you a little to use it, but it's great to be able to have exactly the color of mana you need. And with this mana base, you pretty much do. Now you can also use, these for mana, if you happen to need the colorless mana to play something. But mainly this is the mana. These are more for other purposes. Alright, next cards will be 4 Dark Rituals. So, Dark Ritual makes for a speedy game that really boosts things. You could play the Howling Mine and the Rack on turn 1, or Chains in the Rack on turn 1. And it takes 1 black to play the Dark Ritual. All of these make black. So if you draw the Dark Ritual, you're probably gonna, be able to play it here. Some people don't like Dark Ritual. It's here for the speed. That's really what it's for. If you're worried about being a dead card late game, then remember, in this deck, once you get the combo going, the whole rest of your deck is dead cards. You're never going to draw them. So I wouldn't worry too much about dead cards in this deck. Okay, obviously, Black Lotus. Why not, right? Speed things up. And Mox Jet. again, speeds things up. So basic artifact mana, making things go fast. And soaring. So yeah, that speeds it up. There you go. That is 60 cards. So that's how it works. For sideboard, I would consider some swamps in case your opponent plays Blood Moon. Like, that's something I was concerned about. I would also consider a couple more shatters if they're playing Troll Disco, or anything with Nevinyrral's Disc, like they could sideboard it in. That's something that you could worry about. Maybe more of the Abyss or Tabernacles, like if you're really having a creature heavy opponent, they might help out. Not quite sure what you'd take out for them, but I don't have an official sideboard for this deck. I do have a few more thoughts on it that I'd like to share. So before I developed this version, I had a previous version, and it used Library of Ling. So I was hoping to use Library of Ling in order to discard back to the top of my library when I had to discard for Chains of Mephistopheles. I thought that was an interesting idea, and you can do interesting things with it, but those things aren't what I was trying to accomplish with this deck. So I ended up taking it out, because in this deck, even with Library of Ling, I still ended up not drawing cards, just like my opponent. That's the whole idea here, is to get to a situation where you can't draw anything. And so with library, you just end up with your good cards on top of your library where you can't draw them. It wasn't a useful thing. Another thing that I considered was Storm World, which is the legendary, sorry, not legendary, it's an enchant world. So you can only have one in play, one enchant world. And it works a lot like the rack. It's 4 or less rather than 3 or less, but it affects both players. It has a low casting cost, which was nice, and it's in the right colors, but it kills the Abyss because it's an enchant world like the Abyss. Also, it kills itself if you play more than one, just like Abyss does. And it damages you, because it works on both players. So that didn't work out for me. Too many close calls, almost killing myself with my own cards. That didn't work out. So Storm World is not something to put in here. This deck can mill a lot of cards. It's not intended to be a mill deck, but you could totally run your opponent out of cards. I've seen games end that way. If they have a lot of draw, or if you get lucky and play a lot of Howling Mines, or a lot of Chains of Mephistopheles, then maybe they could run out of cards. Time Twister is sort of a reset for that. So you might want to watch that when you're playing Time Twister. Probably wouldn't worry about it too much, because it's not really your main goal. Like, if the game is locked, then whether they shuffle their library back and set it there and never draw from it doesn't really matter. But you might actually end the game faster if you don't do something like that. So just sort of a timing issue if you're on the clock in a tournament. Okay, another card that I considered was Animate Dead. I was thinking, with all of these cards going into my opponent's graveyard, see, from the discarding and everything, then maybe there would be something good there to get. I could Animate Dead and then beat them up with their own creature. So I'm killing their creatures anyway. I thought that was an interesting idea, but in the end I decided not to go with that because I didn't have many targets of my own, and I had no way of knowing if they would have good targets. And on top of that, by the time the combo was going, I wouldn't be able to draw the Animate Dead in order to use it. So yeah, by the time it had good targets, if I couldn't draw the card, it just didn't seem useful. It wasn't as good as I would have liked. So no Animate Dead in this deck. I also considered Moat and decided that double white was too much. Like, even balance is kind of pushing it. There's not a lot of ways to make white mana. I've got the City of Brass, the Pearl, and the Lotus. Disenchant is something that I considered for getting rid of, opposing artifacts like Nevinyrral's Disc. Disenchant is hands down a better card than Shatter. But I'm already in red because of these cards, and getting into white, as I just mentioned, is kind of difficult. So I stuck with Shatter over Disenchant for that reason. Island Sanctuary is a card that I considered. It does similar things to Moat. Island Sanctuary does some interesting things with Chains of Mephistopheles, because Island Sanctuary allows you to skip your draws, and that lets you leave your library bigger than your opponent's because you're not milling cards. Has some really interesting interactions there. But in the end, I decided it wasn't the way to go for this deck. It does some neat things. Maybe I could build a deck around that interaction at some point in time, but it's not this deck. Wrath of God, the double white, makes it kind of difficult. Swords to Plowshares, I didn't feel it was worth it with all of these. Taking care of creatures. One Swords to Plowshares only gets rid of one. It's kind of a 1-for-1 card, whereas these take care of lots of creatures. Armageddon, probably not worth it. Not only because it's white, but I just don't think getting rid of all the lands is quite what I want to do. It helps if your opponent has too many Mistress Factories, but I think Strip Mine's a better way to go, or maybe even Stone Rain. Like, if you were really having problems with Mistress Factories, Stone Rain might be a decent sideboard card, along with the Shatters and some basic lands. So, the weaknesses. Yeah, you gotta watch out for those so you can prepare yourself. As I mentioned, Nevinyrral's Disc is something to watch out for. Something else to keep in mind is if your opponent gets rid of your Howling Mines. Like, most people don't do that because, as I mentioned earlier, usually when you play a Howling Mine, it's your opponent that benefits from it. So a lot of people won't get rid of Howling Mines. But in this instance, that's kind of what they need to do, because the Howling Mine is what triggers the combo. It forces that extra draw. Some people will play the Howling Mine for you because they're playing them also. But if they realize that they need to get rid of the Howling Mine, then maybe they could play around Chains a little bit. It still empties their hand with just a Chains and, these other cards, but they have a better chance of coming back from that if the Howling Mine is out of the way. But like I said, there's 4 of them, plus the copy artifact, so it's like having 6, so hopefully that won't happen if you're playing this deck. Alright, what else to mention? Hurkyl's Recall would be an interesting card in the sideboard. You could play that to pick up all of your opponent's artifacts and put them back in their hand. That might be interesting, because then they could be forced to discard them in order to draw other cards when the Chains and Howling Mine triggers. So that's an interesting way to get rid of your opponent's cards in play, especially because Mistress Factory is an artifact. Yeah, if they activate their factories and you Hurkyl's Recall them back to their hand, and then the next turn they might have to discard them because of Chains to draw different cards. And it's not a choice. You have to discard if you can. Meekstone is another one that I considered as another way to control creatures, because, defensive things, defensive strategies for this deck. What else to go over? Let's go over an example of Ancestral Recall and Chains of Mephistopheles real quick. Ancestral Recall says draw 3 cards. The way that works is it's like draw a card, draw a card, draw a card. So it triggers Chains 3 times. So if I have a Chains in play and my opponent tries to use Ancestral Recall to draw 3 cards, what they have to do is discard a card, draw a card, discard a card, draw a card, discard a card, draw a card. So that's how that works. Another one that's worth mentioning is Sylvan Library. Sylvan Library does say that you draw the cards. It says you may draw the cards. So the right play with Sylvan Library and Chains of Mephistopheles is probably to not draw the cards. You just choose not to. So Sylvan Library would basically be a dead card. At least it doesn't hurt you that way. Okay, so let's say that you do choose to draw the cards with Sylvan Library. So you choose to draw the 2 cards. Chains of Mephistopheles in play, Sylvan Library in play. You get your regular draw. That's okay. Then Sylvan Library triggers, and let's say you want to draw the 2 cards. What you have to do is discard 2 cards because of chains. So you get your regular draw, and then you discard 2, and then you draw 2 for Sylvan Library, and then the rest of Sylvan Library takes effect, and you either have to pay life to keep them or put them back on top of your library. It's a terrible situation. That's the way it works with Sylvan Library and Chains, and the best thing to do is to choose not to draw the cards with Sylvan Library. If you have multiple chains, like let's say it's Sylvan Library and 2 chains, then you get your regular draw, you discard 2 cards for each card drawn, so you discard 4 to get your 2 cards, and then you still have to pay life or put them back. Yeah, things get crazy with all the card draw people like to do. Next step, I'm going to shuffle this together and goldfish through a game and see what happens, just so you can see kind of what it plays like. Okay, here we go. Picked up all the cards, shuffle them up, cut the deck. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Am I going first or second? Let's go first again. Okay, cards. Things going on. So, going first. Ooh, I don't have much mana here. Do I even want to play that? Why not? Okay, turn 1, 2 Moxes, and the Tabernacle. That's my land drop. Let's put the Tabernacle over here. Okay. And boy, I could play both of those if I Dark Ritualed, but I probably really don't need to. Let's play the Orb. Yeah. So that's turn 1. Moving on to turn 2. They'll be having a hard time with creatures. Okay. That's a little better. Tap this, play the rack. Just kind of waiting here. Turn 3. Ooh. It's really tempting to play that, but I'm going to wait. Turn 4. Demonic Tutor. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Let's Demonic Tutor. Probably 4 chains. Looks like Howling Mine was next. Anyway. There's a chains. So that's in hand. Can I play it? I could Dark Ritual, play it, and activate the orb, but I don't know what my target would be. So, guess I will move on to the next turn. Good draw. Okay, now I'm going to tap this, Dark Ritual for 3, play a Chains, use 1 and this green for Howling Mine, and now I've gotten somewhere. Next turn. Regular draw. Ooh. Then I discard a card. Sorry, Howling Mine triggers, Chains triggers, I discard a card, and then draw another card. So which one of these do I discard? It's going to be the one I can't play. No blue mana. The Abyss, that's nice. Okay, what do I play? The thing to play is the second Chains. I was going to play the wheel, but I drew the Chains, and it's totally the way to go. Unfortunately, I don't have the mana to play the wheel. If I were having a lot of creature problems, you know, the Abyss is tempting, but... So next turn, regular draw, discard a card, sorry, discard 2 cards to draw a card. I'm going to discard these 2 to draw a card, and then I'm going to play Winds of Change. So, 1 card in hand, it gets shuffled in, cut the deck, all right. Now, I'm supposed to draw a card because of Winds of Change. Because I'm supposed to draw a card, both Chains of Mephistopheles trigger. So I'm supposed to discard 2 cards before I can draw this card. Because I can't discard 2 cards, I mill 2 cards. If I could discard 1 card, then I would only mill 1 card. But I mill for each card I can't discard. So I'm going to mill this, and I don't get to draw. My opponent's going to be in the same situation. Neither of us draw for the rest of the game, and the rack will win me the game. I have the Chaos Orb if I need it. If creatures were a problem, I could have played the Abyss earlier, you know, just change the order that I play things in. That's sort of how it works out. I hope you enjoy the deck, and I'll probably work on refining it some because I enjoy it. It's just so different from what you see in most places. It's an unusual deck. That makes it kind of fun. I will catch you next time.